Yeah. Hello.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm a little late. It's I don't really do early mornings.
Likewise.
I totally agree.
Yeah, this makes some problem. Okay. I'm Alex from South Korea. Geoff.
I'm Geoff from Japan.
I'm David from Australia, originally from Ilford.
Yeah, British.
I'm originally from Bolton. Okay.
I studied in Sheffield.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what to say. England is not the place to be just now.
No, you're right.
Or maybe it is. Maybe it's it's. My mother always used to say it was a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
That's one of the Zizek things, isn't it? He keeps on saying that. He was, about Mo, right?
I don't care what he says.
I know. I was actually listening to your battle this morning on my push bike. I don't know when you did it. It was a few years ago when you had that discussion.
Yeah, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I'd say. Yeah, something like that.
That was good fun. I enjoyed that.
I found it deeply uninspiring. It's not.
Anyway, you did a very nice question, to actually penetrate that sort of eloquent,
Well,
discourse.
it's a shtick, it's an act, So, I think is it Freud or Nietzsche who says, when I see a so-called great man, I see someone who is faking their own ideal, and you see it again and again. People get a certain level of status and they become marmoreal. I think less in our culture now. I think that's something that the web paradoxically, at least at an effective level, has a kind of crude democracy about it. I think people find it, I think there's much less authority in that way, or an authority that is situational in that way, that comes of only being able to encounter people in certain ways and in certain kind of settings. Is that a good thing? Maybe. Maybe. But yeah, no, I think I can't tell you how boring I find Marxists, saving any of your presence. I find them almost the most boring subset of theory inflected people, because I haven't changed my view on this since I was 20 probably. What you witness with someone like Zizek is the bed of Procrustes. It's just stretching something always to fit an assumed framework, and for what? It's not.
Well, I was a student after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so that it kind of those discussions, they kind of vanished almost overnight, and that still going on now. I mean, one of my old teachers was Gillian Rose. I don't know if you read her work, famous for The Broken Middle, and she said that now that the kind of the effete indolence of kind of the Soviet regime's gone, then the whole kind of tradition of British philosophy and political economy has come back. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know. You
don't know. You said the most popular writer in Britain at the moment, Sally Rooney, claims to be a Marxist.
Really?
Much approbation, apparently. This
I think
is seen as
normal people.
Is seen as a badge of authenticity, authenticity, I'd say. So either everything's gone full circle and a sort of coffee shop sloganizing has simply become de rigueur, or else there remains, and I think I come at these things from I mean, I think the critique of somebody like McIntyre of Marxism is absolutely right. It is a liberal individualism as far as I'm concerned, particularly when a 30-year-old multi-millionaire, middle brow novelist claims to represent this revolutionary ideological tendency. That's when it's collapsed into liberalism, individualism, and bad faith. So, I'm not surprised that, it continues to haunt the culture at all. Why wouldn't it? There's nothing, there's nothing that could logically replace it in a sense. It just represents the kind of, necessary intersection to partisan kind of arguments about culture. It's the only kind of, intersectional axis that will allow any of those arguments to be potentiated in one way or another, so it's going to be used, isn't it? So in one way or another.
But do you think people are looking for a different kind of political philosophy nowadays to explain, the world as it is, or?
I think that the environmental crisis does represent a novel form of existential crisis, and I think that a lot of the problem in the Western tradition is partly that the Western logos is inherently eschatological. So it people look at it. It's often a problem of people being. They think, well, this can't be right because it's overdetermined. There's a kind of almost a sort of. I mean, I don't know whether Alex can identify this or place it in a Korean context or any context in terms of Eastern thought, which is not so obsessed by linear conceptions of progress in that way. But I think in the West, part of the problem is, as I say, is that it's like a colossal double take. You say to intellectuals in the West, this is a real existential crisis, in my view, and kind of what I tried very much to work on in the trilogy of novels was to show that, maybe in some ways using a dialectic between war, mental pathology, and technology, almost ironically, as a kind of, well, you want a dialectic, here's a dialectic. But, the dialectic really was never important to me in a sense. And you say to them, look, since, the Trinity test in July 1945, which, just as the coronavirus pandemic can be rolled into can now be seen as a outlier of the climate emergency, I would argue, so even can the nuclear bomb as well. At any rate, it's besides the point that I would argue that there is a definitively different existential crisis for human civilizations after July 1945. And that is only intensified. And it is real and different to the kinds of crises that probably going back as far, I mean, as I remember talking to a geneticist who said there was a point at which Homo sapiens sapiens experienced a collapse in numbers in African refugia down to maybe as low as 1,000 individuals. We'd have to go back that far to look at the species, whatever that may be, being under that much threat in quite that way. And I think that that is how these animals pretend to themselves that they're organizing their societies in the light of existential crises such as these is a very secondary issue to me. I'm sorry, maybe that's wrong of me, which is,
to some point, I quite agree with what you said. Is pretend, the human society support that kind of humanity, or some kind of such a higher value. But as you said, in reality, we are killing, each other. And then rich people, they actually don't care about, what's going on today. And even, vaccine, the problem, Is that this, as they said, they decorated, this is a vaccine inequality, something like that. But stupid thing, if you don't, give a vaccine to us global south, this pandemic couldn't be, the end. That is what I'm saying. That people not really interested in stopping, this pandemic. That's my conclusion.
Well, I mean, I think that, I mean, you might be familiar with a character in Dickens called Mrs. Jellyby. And Mrs. Jellyby is always going on about the starving children in Africa while her own children are pulling at her skirt because they're starving, and there was a long article relatively long, what you would call a op-ed piece in The Guardian yesterday by Gordon Brown, the former prime minister here. He's got some, ex officio position with the World Health Organization. He was talking about, what would look on it to be the part of the master discourse of liberal humanists, which is to say, why can't we vaccinate the world? What's the problem here? Arguably, there seems to be already sufficient vaccine manufactured. Well, I mean, the very reason why we haven't vaccinated the entire world against diphtheria or polio, or introduced proper anti-malarial measures in sub-Saharan Africa. They're all the same issue, Gordon. If you've been alive, as long as I think you have been. And beyond that, there's a kind of, Kafka says in the Zurau aphorisms, in respect of all of those, ideologies that think the decisive moment in human history is right now, they're all right, because as far as they're concerned, nothing has happened yet. And reading somebody like Gordon Brown, you see the force of what Kafka said, because he clearly thinks nothing has happened yet. Because if he knew anything had happened, he'd know that the situation in the global south has been parlous for his entire lifetime. So, it's kind of, so, why does he imagine, it is the kind of, what haunts Western civilization is the ghost of a communism that liberal individualists of all kinds believe in. And it shows itself in that kind of statement, a rush and a push and the land is ours, and as we move towards very rapid, probably, degradation of the environment, I mean, really quite shocking losses of any sense of equilibrium. So I'd say that 2019 was the first year with the extent of, I happen to be in California, and the extent of the wildfires in the west of the States, the arrival of things like firenadoes, mixtures between superheated fires and tornadoes considerably affecting human settlement. The news this week, that was the first year that people saw a fundamental disequilibrium, because what we're into now is so-called runaway climate change. There's no fixed correlation between GHG emissions and global heating. They have ceased to be in a linear relationship with each other. So all these things like COP26 are, they're not even rearranging the seats of the band on the Titanic. They're inflecting the notes of the air they're playing. They're that irrelevant, in my view, to what's actually going on now. And you can only expect that, what I suppose the interesting thing for the dispassionate observer, if you can be at all dispassionate, is how long the bulk of the liberal West can persist in this delusional thinking. That's the fascinating thing. What will it take for them to stop saying things. You read articles in the liberal press here, and again, I don't know whether it's the same. I know it's the same in Australia, but I've no idea whether it's the same in Japan or Korea. If you read, whether you read these kinds of articles, and Brown's would be a case in point, where if you analyze it pitilessly, what the article says is bad thing, bad thing, bad thing, bad thing, bad thing. If we all try harder together, it'll be okay.
Mm.
And that's literally all there is to these pieces, because what they're asking for, again, back to Kafka, is a sudden switch in collective human behavior at some extraordinary level. And I don't know whether something comparable happens in the press in Korea or Japan, but if you think about it from my rather more, I would argue, realistic perspective, you have to think to yourself,
Yeah, actually,
this is primarily a form of denial. It's nothing else but denial about it.
as you said, it's actually we live in look like we live in the different world. You said Japan and Korea and Australia, but thing is that today we couldn't actually make any kind of difference according to that kind of geographical differences. That is, in my opinion, a big problem. As you said, actually, you would say Oriental imagination, but I don't think actually we have an Oriental imagination today. We already westernized, even China, actually, even Muslim, fundamentalist. We had the same dream, That means that we cannot imagine outside of this world. I think that is actually a tragic moment, tragic actual reality, in my opinion. So, actually, getting into your work, your trilogy, actually I just read your phone only, but anyway, I found out when I'm reading, you actually try to restore the kind of modernist tradition in literary sense. Your style actually struck me very Joycean, James Joyce style is when I read this phone, it seemed quite the Morris the monologue is actually the end of a sentence, it actually kind of streaming of consciousness, something like that, is following up, and then I reach it at any kind of destination. Something is like liberating your consciousness. But thing is that through this sort of your effort, I was wondering, how could you actually create that outside, or is that your strategy, to try to create some kind of outside or against what we have today or something? That is actually my
well, the novels themselves are an alternative world in that way.
Alternative way.
Not really. I think I'm like a lot of modernists, which is that I labor under the delusion that I'm a realist. The prose style to me has become realism. If you get an email from me, it'll be written the same way. It's not, I've stopped. Obviously I can still write in all of the forms that the English prose is traditionally written, from academic prose through to to anything. I'm a trained writer, so I can write what I want to write. But my natural mode of writing is like that, because, the ellipsis, the use of only really 3 dots for punctuation. In the first book of the trilogy, I play with a lot of late Victorian punctuation and use a lot of stuff like comashes, which are comma, dash, M and N dash combinations, even semicolons and colon dash formulations, which they loved in late Victorian prose. I was reading Ruskin yesterday, and he goes to town with comashes. That's what he really likes. And they introduced both a lot of space into a text in English and a lot of pace as well. But eventually that all gave way to the ellipsis, which really just the use of 3 dots. I came to hate colons, particularly. Not one colons, semicolons had to go. They go early, I think, once you get very committed to trying to purify English prose to some extent. You know, I think the ellipsis captures all sorts of things about our modern technologically mediated consciousness, the three dots, the weighting tones, the sub and ultrasonic sound of electronic equipment, even now, all four of us sort of listening to this whine, this dotty whine in the background. You know, living in the inner city, I don't know if you're all familiar with this phenomenon of the global hum, the idea that there is a background noise to mass technological society that you can hear. That's in the ellipsis. Speech is fragmented and wholly mediatized. It's always coming at us through the phone or through the computer. One-to-one conversations that are sensory and engaged with the potential, you know, less and less, and particularly with the pandemic, less and less as well. So all of that goes into the prose style. And I think particularly what goes in is a determination to reflect the underlying psychic reality that the linguistic turn in 20th century philosophy, evidenced in the analytic tradition in the English-speaking world, evidenced in structuralist and then deconstructionist philosophy in the French-speaking world and elsewhere in the European world. All of that, unquestionably, you know, you might have noticed, Alex, that, you know, perhaps the thing that, you know, offends somebody who believes there's a master discourse in prose most about the books is that there's no, you know, characters are enjammed. You move from one stream of thought into another stream of thought with no interruption. And I think that's why, you know, I mean, everybody kicks against stream of consciousness as a concept, because it seems to both, at the moment, you know, like rather the image it conjures in English, it seems to capture thought and lose it in one, you know, because it seems like a stream of water. You try and hold the water in your hands, it's almost Taoist and it's kind of gone immediately. So how can you have that? If there's any modification on that in my prose as against other writers that have got close to trying to suggest the texture of thought with language, it's this radical Elysian of characters where one goes into another. You know, what is that but an indication of the extent or the lack of the extent, you know, following thinkers like Derrida, that the human mind inheres in language, you know, that it inheres in language. So as against the idea of a stream of consciousness, I'd advance the idea of a web of consciousness, of some kind of, you know, that in as much as, you know, mind subtends in the webs of language, just as much as matter subtends in space-time. You can't really think of a single stream of consciousness. It's an impossible thought, just as there's no private language.
I love that definition.
But I mean, you know, who was it who said all literary careers end in failure? I mean, or is it all political careers? But either way, it's all prose is a compromise. It's just an allusion towards the possibility of something. It's never the thing itself, or it proposes, as you say, Alex, it proposes itself as the thing itself. This is the world, you know, a bit like Borges in Tlon Uqba Orbis Tertius. You sort of go into Tlon and the real world will begin to be immaterial behind you. But certainly I felt that way when I was writing the books, but that's hardly surprising.
A very actually nice, you know, the idea of the literature, you know, in my opinion, actually you said, you know, okay, most of realistic work is definitely presuppose that the dualism, the literary text is here, and that is kind of reflection of something outside of this text. Is reality is there. We need to actually describe this reality properly, something like that. But your actual work is quite different from that. And then that is a little bit classical term, but anyway, the stream of consciousness might be a better, the definition, by which we can get access to your work. That is actually my point. And then, you gave me a very interesting idea, you didn't actually intend, but anyway, just I found out when you said is a kind of how to understand the literature in the age of its technology is quite, the insightful argument about that is go beyond. So how can we go beyond this technological, network or something?
Well, I mean, I think, literature, like any sort of serious art form, is about culture, and culture is about society, and if you live in a society that is facing an existential threat that is real and present and is going to happen almost, pretty much inevitably. I mean, something may happen to forestall the climate emergency. I doubt it. The big climacteric of my later adult life is realizing that it's going to happen, all things being equal, within my life rather than after my life. And I think, like a lot of us, because we're quite short-term thinkers, the fact of my own death in advance of any serious, and by serious I mean potential near-term social collapse, as long as you can factor your death before the near-term social collapse, you think, fine, I'm getting out. I brought up all my children, who are all now young adults, to be aware that there would be sequels of the climate emergency in their lifetime that would be serious, including possibly social collapse. So I did that responsibly. I was aware of this position in respect of my children's generation by the time of Kyoto in 1997. What changed for me in comparatively recently, and I feel a degree of shame for this, only in 2000, and not shame, but it points to me quite how strong denial can be in this area. It wasn't till 2019 that I realized that there was a strong, it was really likely that we would see near-term social collapse in significant social formations in the world if I lived out my allotted span. So I'm talking to my mid-70s, say. So within the next 15 years. And that was a bit of a negative epiphany. In a way, I'd been writing my way towards this with the trilogy. I'd begun to understand the shape of what was happening while writing the trilogy. And what I think is happening, bluntly, and I take your point, Alex, it seems to me it's actually a kind of racist trope to imagine that the hegemonic culture in the East, the Han Chinese culture, in some way, because of its Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist elements, is outside of this, because it isn't. It's absolutely
exactly.
The Han Chinese middle class are exactly like the Western middle class. You couldn't put a cigarette paper between them in terms of this existential threat. I understand that, but you can see that it's extraordinary that in the West, intellectuals would reach immediately for some kind of last chance saloon, which is again technocratic. Maybe the Chinese have a way out of this. They're very clever, Look at how well they've done since the Cultural Revolution. They've completely reversed this stuff. They've got to have a way out of it. Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, that's just madness to think that when Beijing is being submerged in dust storms 100 days a year. I mean, how deep is collective denial in that way? And as I say, it was probably only in 2019 that I made this shift over. And yeah, clearly in such cultures, what's the point of an art that is the mirror of life, you know, as Stendhal would lay out a program for kind of realist literature in that way. What's the point of that? What happens to a culture when the society ends and the society knows it's going to end and represses that knowledge at the same time? You know, what kinds of cultural deformations would you expect to see in a society undergoing that? And the answer is you'd expect to see things like, you know, people being absolutely obsessed by their sexuality and identities built on sexuality. You'd expect to see that. You would expect to see cultures becoming obsessed by a sense of collective guilt over their treatment of minorities within the culture, a kind of weird sort of pathological version of the master-slave dialectic would come over the culture. Check, all of these things are happening. You know, you'd see a culture haunted by images of its own imminent destruction. Again, what you see in cultures today. So, you know, in such a context, you know, what has literature got to do? You know, and I don't, again, I can't obviously speak. I don't know what's happening in Japan. I don't know what's happening in Korea, but I do know what's happening in Australia and in Britain and in the English-speaking world more generally, which is literature is an irrelevance, a powerful irrelevance. And again, you know, the failure to kind of absolutely apprehend this. I began writing about this 7 or 8 years ago. I mean, it's always, you know, characters like me are always, you know, I'm not going to say, oh, nobody wants to hear it. Of course they don't want to hear it. Why would they? You know, it is powerfully irrelevant now, the literary tradition to what's going on. There is nobody in the English-speaking world who seriously orients themselves around a sense of canonical literary tradition. It serves as the meanest fig leaf for one sort of posturing or another and has no real application.
So if you were, you know, going back to your university days and you did PPE, right? Is that right, at Oxford? What would, and if you were a student around, you know, our time now in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, what would you be thinking? What would you study? What would you choose? Would you do the same?
Well, I think, you know, one of the, I mean, I must chide you, Joff. Your construction of the counterfactual shows that you haven't listened to what I said. There are no counterfactuals anymore. I can't think. I only have to go into the room next door and ask one of my sons who are at university right now what they think about it. I don't need to ask myself. I need to ask the people who are in that situation. And,
so what do you say to your students then?
What do I say to my students? You know what English universities are like, presumably, since the implementation of the Brown reforms. My students are mostly from Black and minority ethnic working class to lower middle class backgrounds. I teach at a 2nd to 3rd rate university in Britain, and they're not there to be educated. They're there to be trained. They've borrowed £27,000 from the government, which is on a variable interest rate, and a retrospective alteration can be made to that contract. And they're acutely aware of it because they come from backgrounds with not a lot of money, not a lot of means. They have, particularly in the age of the technological supersession of the codex, they have no desire to do a Gutenberg paper-based degree at all. Their academic class is falling over themselves to pander to the fact that they are now perceived as consumers who rate their courses constantly. An academic class here that has been, you know, expanded and yet restricted simultaneously. In other words, as you know, in British universities or in English universities, a lot of courses are being taught by hourly paid lecturers who have all the job security of people working in McDonald's on a 0 hours contract. So it's a very, very, it is not the idea of the university in any sense at all. It's a training college that prints degrees as a Ponzi scheme. And my students are suitably disillusioned once they can get down to it, the brighter ones, because they understand that they're at the savage end of the rendering fungible of all remaining cultural capital in this society. So I wouldn't even attempt to direct my students to think anything, frankly.
So, I kind of understand what you said, but then you write in your novels about the kind of impacts of technologies on the human sensorium. And as a teacher, I think that you have a responsibility to kind of to somehow to care and to guide the students regarding this reality that they are faced with. And I think that the idea that you can somehow bathe in nihilism or kind of passivity, I think well, I'm against that absolutely. And you know, if you have responsibility to kind of conjure almost even in this bleak time, you know, faced with the Anthropocene and the nuclear accident in Fukushima in Japan and things like that, you have to envision somehow to youth, if you're a teacher. Otherwise, well, then my thought reading your work is, because I've been a student of Bernard Stiegler now for, well, God knows how long. Do you know this gentleman?
I don't know, no.
Right. So Bernard Stiegler had the same kind of image that you presented of, like, the kind of the coming catastrophe and the apocalypse and things like this. But in terms of his idea, then, and he speaks about young people and the kind of the way that they become disindividuated. They kind of they go over to the drives, the violence and drug addiction and alcoholism and and these kind of extreme expressions of a kind of mental illness. And and he began to think about technology and its impact. And in Japan, we have 1 million hikikomori, a social recluse, who've kind of withdrawn from. And this is across the planet now. This is an endemic level. And this idea, he seemed. This is why I got picked up on Stiegler, who was a Marxist in the old days, I guess. And he said that we have to look at technology somehow pharmacologically, going back to the pharmacon in Plato. And that means we have to use technology in a way that kind of at least offers something to young people, to kind of almost use technology therapeutically, as it were. So I was deeply impressed by your book at the phone, because I was wondering, like, what is it nowadays that we are faced with? Is it kind of you're talking about the stream of consciousness and the kind of almost the kind of schizophrenic kind of sense that what's happening to language. It's almost, as you a reader of Debord, it's almost like the real is gone, we're just left with a simulacra, and that means the metaphor is gone and the real is somehow we can't actually contact it. But I was thinking which one is it? Is it kind of this, is it a question of schizophrenia, or is it a question of autism that you would kind of see as a kind of prevalent kind of mental illness? I mean,
well, I figure all of the pathologies. I mean, let me just first, Geoff, take issue with the ghost of liberalism that haunts everything you say and do. I mean, or you're just sounding like an article in The Guardian. We all have to be nice, and hopefully, and of course I'm nice and encouraging to my students. What I mostly try and do is to get them to go leave their phone at home and go for a walk. I mean, you're quite right. Of course, it's terrifying to see that in a society. Lots of young, and if you go back to Debord's original paper, The Theory of the Dérive, he looks at a sociologist long since forgotten called Chambord de Louan, who does an analysis of a single young woman student's kind of life, space-time life, and all she does is walk round a triangle for an entire year. Well, I mean, that was, you know, that gave Debord his conception of the spectacle and the impoverishment of our sensual engagement with the world. I've got students who are exactly the same now, even worse, of course. And all I have to do, frankly, all I've got to do, in my view, to have earned my, you know, to have done my job as a pedagogue, a leader of young people, is to get them to go for a walk. That's literally all I have to do. So I'm not really, I don't feel that I'm in any dereliction of, you know, to get them to go for a walk, not looking at their phone as if it was some sort of breviary that they were taking with them. And I've kind of done my job at that level. I don't need to kind of, you know, say to them, oh, you've got to be optimistic. And also, you know, I've got to push back at this. You know, technology is not instrumental in that sense. It's not value neutral. You can't say things like, you know, what we've got to do with technology is use it wisely. It uses humans. That's what the whole point of the novels is. And, you know, if you take the idea of the Anthropocene seriously, then you take the idea of the thin, you know, the thin edge of the Anthropocene seriously. And if you take a theorist like the kind of prehistorian James Scott seriously, then the Anthropocene begins with hominids using fire 500,000 years ago when this was made. You know, and you know, talk about trying to shut the stable door after the horse has bolted. You know, our entire conception of how human societies operate seems to me quite wrong. And I'm not in any sense sort of wallowing in Nietzschean nihilism at all. On the contrary, you know, I pay all my taxes. I've brought up 4 children. No, I absolutely resent that. What I don't wallow in is delusory liberal humanism. That I'm sorry, I don't wallow in that, because what I see around me is a colossal loss of integrity in our cultures. It is. It's like a kind of soft totalitarianism that has seeped into them. And I'm sorry, the ideology that's to blame is the dominant and hegemonistic ideology, which is liberal humanism. It's not anything else. And it can't even see it in its own image, since it is a totalitarian ideology. And it means, for example, everybody has to look nice, you know, and everybody has to make a little obeisance to the fact that it's going to work out okay. But what if it doesn't? What are you going to say then? What are you going to say when, you know, the Larsen ice shelf dropped off the Antarctic 20 years ago? There's an ice shelf that's 100 times bigger that's about to drop off it in the next 3 or 4 years. And there's going to be a meter sea level rise across the entire world. Most of the low-lying cities are going to be devastated. You know, are you going to say to people then, we have to view technology as therapeutic? I mean, it's not really good.
Can I break in and say a few words, Will? Just say, yeah, I've been reading your work now since the 1990s, and I really appreciate your voice and your talent and your intellectual integrity and everything you write and do. And I live in Australia. Australia is ground zero from what you're saying in a way. 2019-20, we had the largest fires in Australian history. Half of the forests burnt in Australia, and the Prime Minister was in Hawaii with his family and came back halfway through and said, I can't hold a hose. That's his exact words. And I was holding a hose. I'm an intellectual. I work at university. I write books on the Anthropocene and strange things like that. But I was holding a hose, and it was Dad's army out there. It literally was the over 70s fighting 60-meter flames, which were out of control. And it's just a start. That is the beginning of what Australia hasn't got much of a future left. Anyway, that's all, you know, that doesn't matter. So like what you were saying, I can see like there's a tripartite thing that going on. It's like there's the collapse of Western society, climate change, and literature. And, you know, it's like I do, you know, I kind of sympathize with Joff a little bit. It's like the last thing which you're saying, what's the bloody point anymore of writing or even thinking of, being in this situation when we can see it so clearly, this trajectory that we're going on. So I suppose that is my question. I love your writing, your style, your ellipsis. It reminds me a lot of Celine's Journey into the Night and that sort of 1930s Death on the Installment Plan, that sort of, it's gripping, but it's also, it does leave you with this kind of sense of, well, what the hell, what am I to do? What is there to do? I look at things like Extinction Rebellion, or I look at people, trying to kind of go on these climate marches and all that. I just think, oh my God, this is fitting into this very middle class trope of, we're going to make any difference at all when the oil companies and the coal companies. There was a great photo during the Australian bushfires of, there was this fire everywhere, as much fire as you can imagine, and through the middle of it, it's the longest coal train you can see goes off into the horizon, still pumping the coal out. So it is absolute contradiction. And there is no ambiguity about that in any way, shape, or form. So are you kind of trying to go beyond literature now, or is there some other way we can express this, or do we just kind of give up and not give up, but just say, well, we can keep intellectually alive and thinking, but in the end, there's just nothing we can do about it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it is a paradox, isn't it? And I didn't mean to be too abrupt with you, Geoff, but I mean, I have to push back against this stuff because this is critical, and I'm not a kind of, as I say, how can it, I mean, I don't think that the sole fact of having biological children makes a huge difference. I know, my partner doesn't have biological children and she feels the same as I do. So I'm not making that kind of blood and soil point or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, we're all pedagogues, and probably some of you guys have kids as well. I'm not dissociated from this. Of course, I think it's, it's extraordinary and kind of grotesque, but I just can't, when I was a child, there were 2.5 billion people in the world. There are now nearly 9. So, if there were still 2.5 billion people, we wouldn't have this problem, right? So it's all happened on my watch. So clearly, the actions of one person don't amount to a hill of beans. I get that. Does it propel me into a negative quietism? I don't think so. Because here's the paradox. If everybody stopped eating meat and stopped flying more than once a year and didn't own a private car, the problem would be over. Like that. I don't do any of those things. So in a way, I'm one of the most optimistic people there are. I mean, I'm behaving, I am part of the solution I would like to see in the world. Of course I am. I mean, just on the not eating meat thing, that's what I did in 2019. That was my response to the awareness of the inevitability of social collapse as I saw it within my own lifetime, was to paradoxically do the one thing that I could personally do at a personal level that would, scaled up, avert the crisis. I stopped flying. I haven't owned a private car for years. And I became a vegetarian. So far from, isn't that the paradox of human nature in one? These things are ultimately unknowable. Everything, my theory, everything that I know empirically about human nature, the way people behave, leads me to believe this cannot be averted. I agree. My sense of personal autonomy and what it is I can actually do leads me to believe that if I do this and everybody did as I did, the crisis would be averted. There you have it in one. I don't have to think particularly therapeutically about technology. I just have to stop eating fucking beef. Sorry, pardon my, it's like, I mean, talk about, rabbit-proof friends. I mean, talk about Australia as a cattle run that is, it is completely a society that has died on a barbecue. I mean, your image, David, is extraordinary and shocking, of a dad's army fighting 60-meter high flames, a prime minister returning from Honolulu to say, I can't hold. And in the center of this country, the remnants, the tattered remnants, again, like an image from Borges, like his fragment, The Exactitude of Science, in the middle of this ancient, giant desert continent, the remnants of a 40,000-year-old culture that survived all of that time, 40,000 years, by a complete interlinkage of a sustainable philosophic position in a deeply fragile ecology. You know, the whole of the high Aboriginal culture was developed to sustain conscious creatures in a flow state of ecological and environmental sustainability. That's why that culture is so baroque, so complex, so evolved. It has this extraordinary, talk about a literature. You know, I always say, if I'm teaching students about literature, I say you don't have to be an evolutionary psychologist, but it helps. There's basically two stories: who is God and where is the food? And the thing about high Aboriginal culture in Australia is, you know, who is God and where is the food are the same story. They're the same story, and it's told over and over again. And if you look at Western or, you know, Oriental societies in that way, where's God and who's God and where's the food diverged a long time ago. And that's where our problem lies. You know, we don't, we're not going to be able to push them back together again. But I don't see quietism and an acknowledgement of quietism as a defeat. I see it as exactly the toolkit that people are going to need for survival. They're going to need to be able to appreciate the limits of their own efficacy for once. They're going to need to be able to appreciate that technology is never value neutral, because that's what got us into this trouble. Was believing that technology was purely instrumental. You know, that's why, as I was saying to Alex, we're still dreaming that some kind of Han Chinese kind of Taoist techno solution to the problem is going to ride to the rescue. You know, and I think that is a real sort of delusion in the West, actually, about that. The Chinese, maybe the Chinese will fix it. The American hegemons failed. You know, maybe. I mean, Jinping seems really confident. You get lots of stuff in the press here about, they didn't really, not a lot of people died in Wuhan, you know. So, you know, I don't see my quietism as wallowing in nihilism at all. I see it as almost ruthlessly pragmatic, you know, and responsible. Can I just,
you know, pick up on the first point? You know, 3 points is that the collapse of Western civilization is, you know, is this process augmenting? Is it just kind of getting worse and worse and worse all the time, or is it kind of a long drawn out, painful, torturous kind of over? You know, I haven't lived in the UK now since the year 2000. So, you know, I just get it through the news, and it just seems one absurd, ridiculous Brexit-orientated stupidity after another. And so I'm not living inside it. I'm kind of objectively looking at it. And I just kind of wonder when is the agony going to stop? And you're talking about the contrast between Aboriginal culture with this continuity and this connection to ecology and God and myth and storytelling and the body and everything, and then the British culture, which came over here and, you know, colonized it, and it was full of this kind of, you know, colonels who were homosexuals but didn't admit it, and you know, forcing Aboriginals families apart and misunderstanding everything, and then dying because they just couldn't cope with living in this country which is too hot, or, you know, floods or whatever. So it's you know, is the collapse of Western culture or British culture, is this something that you think your novels, how does the sort of, you connect with that in terms of, is it kind of, are you kind of spinning it along to a happy death, or are you just going along with the ride of this collapse?
Well, I mean, Eliot said, art without intellection is vanity. Actually, I think Ecclesiastes says pretty much the same thing as well. I think, as I say, I don't think that the writers of fiction have had any role as public intellectuals of any significance for 40 or 50 years. So I mean, I'm not even known particularly as a writer of fiction in England, except when it suits a certain kind of, you remember England. It's like a kind of, it's a culture that's like the lower sixth form common room at a minor public school. I mean, it has all the kind of gravitas of a lot of 16-year-old, slightly privileged, slightly snobbish boys kind of ragging each other.
I was at Warwick University during the 90s, so we were kind of an intellectual elite. So we did discuss your decent high level writing, and it was very important to us. But as you say, you go beyond those borders, and there was nothing.
Yeah, and I don't really think there's anything in public life here. I mean, even if you look at the top line of, I think there. I mean, I would have think in the academy here. I mean, I'm not. The academy is in a crisis in a sense. It must be, despite the massive extension of student numbers here. That there's a collapse in people wanting to read English for obvious reasons. It has no employability. As I say, universities have become training schools, and it has no cultural centrality either. So, it's going to be, I've got a long piece in Harper's in New York this month on trauma theory in the humanities, and you can understand why I'd be drawn to critique that. But really using it as a stick to beat English studies, English literature studies, more generally, because I think that, and I've always felt the same way. I'm sorry, this goes back to, I realized this in my teens. Sorry, there was a reason I studied politics and philosophy rather than literature, which was I already understood that, what was happening culturally was that philosophers were crawling up the necrotic back passage of literature in order to, say things about texts that they were no longer licensed to say about the real world. And in the process, were trying to cloak themselves in the rights of the artist, just as artists were kind of, giving up on any conceivable attempt to be involved in the real public life of the culture. So it's a kind of mutual a mutual meltdown. And you see it, of course, in the rise of the creative writing programs in Western universities, which are, the writers going in the opposite direction, sort of crawling up the necrotic back passage of academia in an attempt to escape their own irrelevance. So, I don't know what it's like one of my sons, when they get exasperated with me, they go, what do you want from me? Exactly. You seem to want something from me that is different to what I'm offering you, but I'm not sure. I mean, you seem to want me to lay claim to some master discourse of some kind. You want to reassert the Western logos, the pedagogic tradition, and you want it to be efficacious. If it can't, tend the arc of history, you at least want it to make young people feel better about things. You're worried, and I would, urge you not to be. You're worried as responsible pedagogues that young people are getting frightened and disturbed and upset. 'Twas ever thus. There's a kind of hubris in trying to say to them, at this point, well, we know where we're going, because, half of these greenhouse gas emissions are in our adult lifetimes. So quite clearly, our agency really hasn't worked out that well since we did it when we were aware of what we were doing. So it doesn't look good at that level. I think, you don't have to be particularly rarefied to understand that of necessity the character of thought in this era is going to be stoic in one sense or another. How could it not be? For heaven's sake, David, you were out there with a hose, so most of all that's the case. But I do think that the one thing I would offer that is different is to absolutely purge any of those kind of delusions of liberal humanism at this stage. Yes. They will serve us so poorly, and one of the ones that serves us particularly poorly is this obsession with the idea that the one thing I would, why is Brexit a disaster? Brexit is, again, just part of what's going on now. What would you expect to happen? But that the European Union is the biggest and most efficient engine for generating greenhouse gases in the Northern Hemisphere, besides the US federal government. So, why wouldn't it break up? It's an obvious kind of thing to start happening, and again, looking at it in ideological terms and saying, well, this is a terrible upsurge in nativism, and what we have to use against it is the same thing that brought us Bretton Woods, the United Nations after the Second World War. That's what we've really got to do now, because that was such a huge success. Yes. That really, that presided over the Trente Glorieuses, during which we did all of that emitting.
No, it's like a catalogue of absurdities, because seeing Brexit, for example, if you take the Brexit thing, what we got was interviews with someone down the Romford market saying, yeah, I think it's a good idea, mate. Yeah, it's great, isn't it? That was our kind of view on the whole political apparatus, how it happened. In fact, it was this enormous, complex, kind of breakup of laws and tariffs. And I actually
the point is, David, if a working class person where you guys come from had nothing to thank the European Union for at all. That was true. The people who benefited ostensibly and most clearly from the EU were the metropolitan middle class. That was just a fact. That those benefits were not passed on. The Gini coefficient in this country has declined year on year since 1976. Yeah. When people swung to vote Tory in the last election in the so-called red, now blue wall constituencies, I'm sorry, it is deeply patronizing of people, in middle-class professional metropolitan cultural contexts to say to these people, basically what people said to them is, you're stupid working class people. I mean, I'm not saying that's what you were saying, David.
No, I just say that's the image we saw. I'm not commenting. No,
well, I'm sorry. It is. I went round and did due diligence with these people and asked them what they were thinking, and I would have thought as they did and wanted to and felt exactly the same way. Why would you? And again, in the context of the climate emergency, since Maastricht and then Scheveningen, Europe, what was Europe? Europe was, I'm going for the weekend to Prague. You come into Prague. No, I've done Prague. I'm going to Genoa. Genoa's cheap. The last 20 years before the pandemic, you could look up into the sky over London and see hundreds of thousands of people flying overhead, shitting out carbon en route for a stag or hen party in Tallinn, or to kind of bag, the fungibility of place. And that was the European Union. That was the European Union.
is a incredible mobility comes up. Yeah.
Extraordinary mobility. It was a really deeply neoliberal project to render itself fungible in that way. You don't have to be, a supporter of Mellencamp or a kind of gilet jaune to see the impact of that on working class life right across the continent. So no, I was a Brexit agnostic. The point about Brexit was not any people can be self-determining, and I'm sorry, Brexit has shown up, and that's why right today this is a fascinating day to be speaking, because of course I would say the British state has looked as threadbare and as incompetent and as kind of wholly kind of mismatched with any kind of sense of political agency. This is as bad as I've seen it, probably since Black Monday and the Tory government crashing out of the exchange rate mechanism in the early 90s, certainly. And I would say it's worse than that, actually, because of the public health dimension. And so, back full circle, because I'm going to have to leave you guys fairly soon. This is, these are the interesting times of the Chinese curse, quite clearly. And I was a Brexit agnostic, any kind, because what essentially you had to give Brexiteers the benefit of the doubt, even though, of course, personally, I found them abhorrent as people. You had to give them the benefit of the doubt because they were calling out these regimes on their shadow play of democracy. Because what has gone on in this society is that economic elites have continued to benefit while hiding behind various fig leaves of kind of internationalism or human rights or whatever you choose to call it. Because the fact of the matter is the poor have got poorer, the rich have got richer, and the rich have carried on emitting greenhouse gases all they bloody can all the time. And that's what I see.
So what do you think about Branson and jumping in his spacecraft and Bezos, and at the precise time when the world,
almost certainly the most deluded of all, the classic kind of, I mean, it's like something out of Greek mythology. It's so kind of primal and ridiculous and absurd. But, I just don't. I think that when you look at the grand, again, my point is you can look at all of the weird cultural deformations. And again, they're in Korea and Japan as well as in the West. They're the same deformations, but expressed differently because of the different cultures. When you look at them, what it makes me think of, this is my image, is of an ice sheet pushing against land, and it forms what they call pressure ridges. And, when something comes to an end, the waves come backwards into the social form. And this is what we're witnessing. This is the beginning of the end. And that's why things look like that. When you start to realize that, it shouldn't fill you with gloom. It should fill you with a sense of extraordinary privilege, and extraordinary interest and engagement with what's going on about you. The paradox of our situation is, one thing you can say about apocalypse is it isn't going to be dull. It's it's.
Actually, if I add on when you're talking about such a apocalypse and the end of a civilization, Warwick Anderson he's a Australian anthropologist, and then he wrote a book about the invention of a sanitization or some modern medication. He actually went to a Philippines and he actually studied in a kind of field work. And then he found out, that such a modern medication mostly focused on how to survive in such a tropical climate, for a white man. That means actually the European and American. And he actually wrote a book about, history of medication, and definitely that is related to such a colonization something. Okay, I don't want to actually say focused on such a colonization, the caused all kind of these kind of things. But what I mean actually that our civilization or some end of civilization, we're quite easily talking about, environmental crisis. But thing is that that is very limited, the scope of the civilization. Actually we have crisis of civilization. We actually, the enjoy, today. Not really, it's some sort of, that the world as such, the world is not actually crisis, another world is coming.
No crisis at all in some sense.
But that is why I said, actually, I quite agree with this, such a delusion. What kind of delusion? This is a definitely very too much concentrated idea of such a civilization, too much, the obsession in. We don't want to lose actually this, the enjoyment is a status quo. We want to sustain the status quo. We are talking about end of civilization, climate crisis, but as you said, it's some kind of, the economic elite, try to, keep on this in the route. They don't want to change the direction. That's why actually we need a kind of politics, to actually solving this problem. This is, in my opinion, political things, not any kind of environmental. It's not like a natural thing. This is a political thing. We must change this system. Otherwise, we're gonna die, or this civilization will collapse. That's what I'm thinking.
That's true, but human societies are not good at organizing collective ends without high levels of consensus. That, that's what I was saying about where's the food and who's God. You need a strong coincidence between that. And the problem with Western society at the moment is it thinks its soul lies in the opposite direction. Liberalism has given up on the present and is colonizing the past. Why would a society spend so much time worrying about what people did hundreds of years ago right now when it faces an existential threat? It hardly seems appropriate. And of course, you're right, objectively, Alex. I see it every day. In a moment, I'm going to have to leave you guys and I can walk out onto the Brixton Road. I live in central London in a majority Black British community. So there are Black people of African and African Caribbean descent. They don't wear masks. They're not vaccinated. This borough has the lowest vaccination level of any borough in London, in Britain. We have the Omicron variant is running rife right here, right now. The local hospital trust issued a state of emergency 2 days ago. It's accepting nothing but COVID patients, okay? If you actually bother to talk to the people who I live with in my community, then what you find out is they simply cannot see what these old white men are getting up and women are getting upset about at all. They come from societies on the whole with high levels of endemic infectious disease, and they simply cannot see the pandemic culturally. They can't even see it. And they have a profound mistrust, exactly what you were saying, Alex, of Western medicine in that way. Something that people in the West simply cannot understand. And frankly, it's insulting not to get it. I mean, I was in hospital a few weeks ago and I was being treated by nurses of African heritage who were unvaccinated. So, this is live action for me. It's not kind of something that exists at a remove in any meaningful way at all. It's real and present. Listen, it's been lovely to talk to you, but you'll forgive me. It's
okay.
10:15. The day is getting going. It's been, we perhaps haven't talked as much about literature as we might, and I sensed, maybe wanting to pull me back. And I would say I'm guilty as charged, like a lot of a certain kind of writer, which is that I run out of literature, if I'm honest. I don't find myself, if I ever did, that I can exist in a substrate of the literary in that way. It does, for all of the things that I've animadverted. And really, if you look at the kind of top line, and I've got a collection of my essays and critical writing coming out next year called Why Read? So that really says it all. That's the question you were asking me, So in a way, my occasional writing and critical writing of the last 20 years does all answer that question. And why read? well, why is our little group gathered here across the world by agency of this technology right now? Because there are some people who are simpatico, because whenever you write, you in theory address only one reader who stands proxy in their anonymity for the potential of all readers. That's not a humanist claim. It's just a claim about communication and the fact of it. And so, you know, I continue to write. I'm working on another novel. I've written short stories this year. I continue to write essays. I have this long essay on trauma theory and the humanities in Harper's. I continue to do everything I've always done. Of course, I'm going to carry on doing it. I would say the one difference is that what I do acknowledge is that you know, that in as much as that cultural enterprise is less significant, is in direct ratio to the extent to which it's commoditized. And what I've seen throughout my own literary career as a publishing and working writer is the intense commodification of the writer. And, you know, book bags with Joan Didion's likeness on them, you know, Margaret Atwood signing her books using a long pen that works through a computer system. All of this bullshit that is evidence, you know, back to Eliot. This is art without intellection, and it is vanity. It's nothing but vanity at a collective social level, you know, merch and kind of stuff like that. And yeah, you know, I'm fed up. I would rather, you know, not have readers than have them on those terms, or tend what I'm doing in that direction.
Thank you for your participation, and then nice talk. It's fantastic talk, but very insightful. Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you all. And I'm happy if you feel I haven't covered anything you'd like a supplementary on, please do email.
All right. Okay.
Have a good day,
Thank
everyone,
you.
or night.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.